Welcome to the Author's Corner. I'm Ethan Yang. Adam Smith is probably one of the most influential thinkers of the modern period. His ideas have influenced everything from the way we think about economics to the way we think about social life. Joining us today is AIER visiting fellow as well as professor of English at St. Lawrence University, Caroline Breashears. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about just who Adam Smith was. So can you explain to us who was he, what were his big ideas, and why are they so important today?
So, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. He was born in Scotland in 1723, and he died in 1790. And so he was part of a major intellectual movement of the period. He was best friends with David Hume, corresponded with Voltaire. And so he is best known for his works, The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments. But he did so much more than that. What a lot of people don't know is that Adam Smith actually started his career as a professor teaching lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres. And he did something very innovative with this. He started introducing into the curriculum in Scotland texts by English authors, British authors. And so he was including works by Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, as opposed to restricting his content to classical authors. So he started off in lecturing on rhetoric, and then he became a professor lecturing on a wide variety of things. So they didn't have that kind of specialization we have today. And he also wrote about and lectured on ethics, and this is his course lectures became the Theory of Moral Sentiments. His lectures on economics inform his Wealth of Nations. He also lectured on jurisprudence, and he wrote widely on other subjects, including the history of astronomy and the formation of language. And his works have had a significant impact today. Probably his most well-known contribution to economics is his idea of the invisible hand. And he used this as a metaphor for the process by which people acting in their own interest, without intention, created benefits to other people in society, socially beneficial consequences that were unintended. And so this has been hugely influential on later economists like Hayek, and it really shifted the way in which people approached economics, and in fact had a huge impact on politicians of his time. The prime minister at the end of the 18th century was consulting him, right, for advice on how to lead well in the government. The invisible hand also, there's a connected concept with that, which has been very influential. And it's this insight that it's those unintended consequences of your personal actions that are beneficial, but that if you deliberately try to plan everything, then you end up with what Smith called the man of system. And this is a really influential concept, because was that the man of system who thinks he can plan everything doesn't have enough knowledge. And so he uses this beautiful illustration of a chessboard. He says the man of system thinks he can move people around on this chessboard of life. And he's not recognizing that the pieces on that chessboard, the individuals he's trying to manipulate, have motives of their own and may not follow what he's telling them to do. And he says when that happens, society can become very chaotic. And so this is, a warning against what we now call central planning. So Smith has had a huge impact on economics.
And he has, like you mentioned, these two major books, which are The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And to our viewers, have you ever seen these books? These are thick books. So just in case, maybe I'm sure all of our listeners are probably not going to go read it immediately. So can you explain to us what those two books were about? What were the big contributions to intellectual thought?
Great. So the theory of moral sentiments is lesser known, but it's beginning to get a lot more attention now. One of the major contributions to this was that Smith is looking at ethics, and so he's trying to tackle these questions about what is the nature of virtue and how do we know it. And it's in that latter question that he makes his most significant contribution. And he says that we come to know virtue, we come to judge virtue through what he calls this impartial spectator process. And it starts with sympathy, right? You see someone, he says, we see our brother on the rack, someone who's suffering, and automatically the human impulse is to say, what's wrong with him? We're interested in his fortunes. And so we go through this process of trying to understand the situation of that person, right? Trying to put ourselves in that situation and understand what he must be experiencing. And then from there, we make a moral judgment about that. And then we compare our sentiments with the behavior of the agent who is, suffering, in order to make a determination about the morality of that person's behavior. And so it's this impartial spectator process. Now, what makes it especially important for today is that Smith was able to show how that process can be used for self-judgment. And so his idea here is that when we are acting or we are about to act, we can invoke that process by stepping outside of ourselves, imagining how an impartial spectator would view what we are doing. And that enables us to gather the information we need to make a good moral decision about how to act. And this is especially important in daily lives as we're making decisions. And it's also important when what we're doing may not be the popular thing to do. But the impartial spectator helps us realize that it's the correct thing to do. This is a theory essentially of conscience, well before Freud came up with his theory of conscience. And so it's been very influential and a really valuable contribution to our understanding of ethics and how we work. And of course, with the Wealth of Nations, that idea that, pursuing your own self-interest in, an ethical way can have unintended social benefits. That was very important. Smith also, in the Wealth of Nations, really highlighted the problems of mercantilism and the distortions that can be created when, certain business interests are exerting undue influence on the government, right? And creating problems there because that's not a genuinely free market. And so Smith was very, very much opposed to that.
Seems like a lot of those ideas, the same problems that we have today, were very much being explored back then. I don't know if that's supposed to make me happier or sadder, but so the theory of moral sentiments, I had to read that when I was in college, and to be frank, it's some 18th century language, right? It took me a while to understand and really get through that. But you actually really transcribed those ideas into a more accessible format in a recent article you wrote, where you basically tied in the plot to Harry Potter with many of the major concepts that came from the theory of moral sentiments. So can you explain what inspired you to write that, and what are the similarities that you saw?
So because it tracks the progress of the protagonist, Harry, through a number of years of his life. And so reading those series, we see him growing up, and we see him growing in sympathy and in moral judgment. And so Rowling's novel makes that process very transparent through lots of techniques, both realistically and magically. So, for instance, Harry, as a young man or a boy, he's abused by his relations. And even though that might make someone, resentful or turn to bullying other people. What Harry does is he's able to reflect on that experience and extend his sympathy to other people he sees might being bullied. And this is how one of the great friendships in literature comes about, with Harry exhibiting that friendship and that sympathy toward Ron Weasley, who is being bullied by, if you've read the series, Draco Malfoy, one of the figures who starts off as a sort of villain. As the series progresses, we see Harry growing up and learning to apply that process to himself. And so, initially when he's very young, he's very hurt when people misunderstand him or misjudge him because they don't know his situation. But as he grows up, he learns how to use the impartial spectator process to assess when he's actually doing the correct thing, right? And understanding that he's being judged unfairly by his peers. And he's also able to use that process to determine when he is misbehaving, right? If you recall in the Order of the Phoenix, Harry becomes very jealous of his friend Ron, who was made a prefect. And Harry actually invokes this impartial spectator process, which Rowling dramatizes beautifully by representing that conscience as a small voice, correcting Harry when he's going wrong. And so he's able to put things into perspective and understand the correct response, which is to support Ron and to be happy for him and to understand that he's not been slighted in the way that he thought he was. And this is all really interesting in relation to Rowling's investment in empathy. You may know that she worked at Amnesty International for a long time, and that experience had a profound impact on her view of morality. And she talks about this very eloquently in her book, Very Good Lives, which is based on a speech she gave at Harvard. And the main gist of it is that we have to have empathy, right? And empathy can be used for good or it can be used for evil. And so what she's showing in the Harry Potter series is having empathy with other people, whether it's your peers or whether it's with the house slaves, right? In Harry Potter, can lead you toward making good moral choices if you are using sympathy and trying to understand them morally, as opposed to the villain, Voldemort, who is using his understanding of people to manipulate them. And so, of course, in the end, it's Harry who triumphs because he's able to bring everyone together, including the house elves, through this kind of sympathy and moral judgment. It's just really beautiful in those messages.
And I will admit, when I read the Harry Potter series, I was not able to extract the same level of meaning as Caroline was, but that's probably because I haven't looked into it as much as she has as well. So let's dive into those points a little bit deeper, those technical points you bring up. You bring up the impartial spectator, you bring up judgment, you bring up sympathy. So what did Adam Smith, what was he trying to convey when he was writing about that? And then how did Harry Potter end up conveying that same message as well?
Right. So Smith is trying to understand how and why we reach these moral judgments. And so Rowling is depicting that process both realistically through Harry growing up and interacting with people and reflecting, but also magically, right? She has this magical device in the Harry Potter series. It's this bowl, she calls it the Pensieve, in which there's this kind of liquid, and in it people can place their memories. And so this is a really interesting technique for teaching people is the spectator, in this case, say Harry, is able to place his face in that ball and look at someone's memories as they actually happened. So it's in detail, it's realistic. It's not as the person wants it to be. It's the truth, right? So he's able to, it's the impartial spectator, and truly understanding someone else's situation. And it's really transformative for Harry, because when he does this, he is able to see, for example, that one of the most horrible professors at Hogwarts, Snape, who has bullied Harry and has been very terrible to Harry, that Snape was himself bullied by Harry's own father. And he's able to see in detail what actually happened and why Snape is so resentful and why Snape is acting the way he has, right? And he has this extraordinary sympathy for Snape at this moment, and he realized that his judgment of his father, whom he had not known, is not on the mark, right? And so in that process, he's understanding not only the people around him, but he's also understanding himself and how his moral judgments can be distorted by not having complete information. And so it's a really beautiful depiction of that process in magical terms.
Hmm. And so these ideas that are in the theory of moral sentiments that are, are appearing in Harry Potter, and obviously we can observe it in normal life. What are the implications? So what? Like, what should, as a society, if we embrace these ideas, like how should we go on to look at one another and really observe how society, especially in the pantheon of, all the different ways to look at society, like
Mm-hmm.
why is this one so profound, and why, or I guess I personally subscribe to the ideas in the book. So why should other people take these ideas as their way of looking at society and not a different way?
Uh, Great question. I do think Smith is especially helpful for our culture at this particular moment when we have a lot of conflict. One of Smith's points is that the impartial spectator, that ability to judge ourselves, is never so distant from us as in the midst of faction. And he's talking about political factionalism, he's talking about religious fanaticism and the divides that this creates. And he's saying, when people are worked up based on party, they're not able to judge themselves and other people accurately. Okay. And so this is when we most need that process, when we most need sympathy and correct judgment of ourselves as well as other people. And in that process, and the rest of Smith's book lays out, key virtues as well as the process for understanding them. And when he talks about those, the critical virtues, that the ones at the top, include justice and beneficence, which are really, really important. Smith says that justice is the pillar of society. And so we always have to go back to what is the just thing to do. And beneficence is the ornament of society, which means that it's something that we love and we want to promote, but it can't be extorted by force the way that justice does. And so our process has to start with justice, right? Before we get to demanding beneficence, because that's not something that you can force people to do or that you should force people to do. The sympathy also, I think, is very, very helpful in relation to the justice, because Smith was very much a champion of the downtrodden, right? He was very generous with his own wealth, but he was also very aware of the injustices committed in his own society. He was very, very anti-slavery. He's very clear on this, right? And so he's just a really good moral guide for us in the theory of moral sentiments, and very balanced and helpful in the sense that he's not presenting ideals that it would be impossible for an ordinary mortal to achieve. He's presenting a practical morality. And he intended it to be a practical morality, because that's what he said he was doing in his final edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is really expanded. He's trying to deal with how do we live in a society in which it's really hard to be a morally correct person? How do we deal with all the temptations to our vanity? How do we deal with the temptation to pride? Where is that happy medium? And so Smith is very concerned about that. How do we live on this planet as it is, not in some utopia?
Caroline, thank you so much for a very insightful and eye-opening conversation on a very important topic. Caroline Breashears is a scholar of Adam Smith, a professor of English, and a visiting research fellow here at AIER. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to follow us more on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, as well as look at our website at aier.org. If you really like what you heard and you want to support more cutting edge research like this, feel free to become a donor. You can find all that information and more at aier.org. This has been the Authors Corners podcast. Thank you.